Hey, what's up, guys? Pastor Aaron coming to you again from my basement. This has kind of become like my man cave, and your wherever you watch these has kind of become, I guess, our new youth room now in this whole pandemic and everything. So it's amazing how something so weird suddenly kind of becomes your new normal. And I want to kick us off tonight with a little story. And I won't want to take a bunch of time, so I'll kind of keep the specifics to a minimal. But growing up, my family and some of the friends of our family, we all had different versions of boats, jet skis, things like that. I was very fortunate to be able to do a lot of those things on a regular basis. And my dad owned a boat, and we would take it out on Lake Michigan, Green Bay, Green Lake, things like that in Wisconsin, and just do, I guess, normal boat things like go super fast because my dad liked to drive his boat fast, and or as fast as like a boat goes, I guess. And we do things like like tubing and stuff behind it, and it was just a fun time. And when you spend a good amount of time on the water, whether it's in fishing boats, which I've done a lot of too, it's if you do that a lot, things aren't always going to be ideal. Sometimes it's going to be colder than you wanted, or it's going to be windier than you wanted, or or a storm might roll in. And one time we were out boating. I can't remember if we were in the Green Bay area or on Lake Michigan, but a really bad storm came up that wasn't really expected, and the storm came up so aggressively and so hard that the waves that we were trying to get our boat through to get back to the safety of the marina were massive. They were big enough that now we didn't have, we weren't out there yachting. Okay, just so you guys know, these were not massive boats or anything. But the waves of this storm were as such that we were had to ride the boat up the waves, crest over the top, and then ride them down the waves into like a trough of water, and then ride the boat back up the waves. So these waves are pretty big. And at the time that that was happening, I was a teenager. I was the opposite of risk averse at that point in my life. Took a lot of chances and did a lot of things and thought dangerous things were pretty fun, and I still kind of do think that way. And so when I say to you that I was scared in those moments, it's because it was a legitimately frightening ordeal to go through. Now we got through it. God was amazing, and we got back to the safety of the boat dock area, and where the weather was really minimal because they have storm breaks in marinas to make sure that doesn't happen. And so once we got off the boat and onto land, I mean, the storm was still raging. It was still pouring like crazy, and there's thunder and lightning everywhere, which is always cool. As long as you don't get struck by that lightning, it's neat to watch. But once it was all said and done, the storm that was so terrifying out on the water, once you were on land, that storm was just a nuisance. Like, oh, well, it's not a big deal here. It was a really big deal out there, and I felt like I was going to die. But now that I'm on land, I'm just wet and kind of cold and just annoyed. And so tonight, our little digital Devo is called Who Are You? And our text comes out of the book of Matthew, or book of Matthews, depending on who you are, chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. I'm just going to read that for you guys right now. And it says, Then Jesus got into the boat and started across the lake with his disciples. Suddenly, a fierce storm struck the lake. I can relate. The waves were breaking into the boat, but Jesus was asleep. The disciples went and woke him up shouting, Lord, Lord, save us, we are going to drown. Jesus responded, Why are you afraid? You have so little faith. Then he got up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and suddenly there was a great calm. The disciples were amazed. Who is this man? They asked. Even the winds and the waves obeyed him. Now, Jesus had just got done doing a lot of work in chapter 8. If you read the beginning of this chapter, he heals a ton of sick people and people that have different conditions. And then he also casts out a lot of demons. People were bringing individuals to him that were demon possessed, demon oppressed, and he was doing all that stuff. And then he had an encounter with some people who wanted to be his disciples, and he kind of taught those people and his disciples what it was like to follow him and the cost that would come along with that. And they really did this from morning until the evening. So this was a whole long day affair, and it was busy, man. It was a busy day, and Jesus, he was tired. And so at the end of the day, knowing that they needed to go across the lake for business the next day, Jesus tells his disciples, hey, we're all going to get in this boat because it'll be much faster if we just cross the lake. And so the disciples, were like, oh, that makes sense. I don't want to walk around the whole lake anyway. It's big sea, so we'll just boat across this bad boy. And so they all hopped, in their little boat. Well, actually, there was, there was 12 disciples and Jesus. There's 13 of them that you know of. Maybe there are a couple more passengers, so it was probably a pretty big boat, actually. So it wasn't very little. Unless you can comedically see Jesus and his 12 disciples all chilling in like a tiny, like rowboat type situation where they're like standing room only, but I doubt that's what was going on there. They all got in this boat that was sizable to some degree, and they started across the water. And then something happened. So they get in the boat, Jesus goes in the back, he falls asleep, and his disciples are like, he's tired. And they start rowing across the lake, and things don't go so good. Suddenly a storm rolls in the evening, and the waves get a little bigger, and there's a lot of wind, and there's probably some rain, and then and they're probably like, well, this is no big deal, it happens. And then the waves got bigger, and then they got bigger, and then they got bigger, and they were getting a little more worried, and the rain was a little harder, and there was a little more wind. And before they really could even realize it, the Bible says the waves were so big that they were breaking over the boat, which means that they were sailing this boat into waves that were so massive that like walls of water were cascading into the boat, which is bad because that's how boats sink when they get too much water in them. And so Jesus is just chilling in the back. He must have been in a good spot, because if there's water coming over the front of the boat, it must have been long enough that the water isn't hitting him, so he's staying asleep, or otherwise he was getting wet and he was just that tired that he was like, no, I'm going to stay. I don't care if I'm getting soaked. I'm going to stay asleep. So he's sleeping in the boat. And the thing to remember about this story is that the disciples were not scared men. Several of them were actually fishermen. Many of those individuals grew up fishing on the Sea of Galilee, the very sea that they were crossing right now. They have been on this body of water their entire lives. And the topography of the area is as such that when the wind comes into that valley, that it creates tumultuous storms on that lake all the time. This is not a random, never happening occurrence. This does happen there. And so although it was a young lifetime, through a lifetime of fishing before Jesus called them, they had seen weather similar to this on that sea before, and so they were used to that. But this storm was so powerful and so vicious as such that it terrified them, to the point of them panicking and running to Jesus, because if they would have ran to Jesus who was asleep, it's because everything that they would have known to do to keep a boat floating in a storm had already failed and was failing, and the boat was sinking. Like, Jesus was their absolute last option. Like, they had no other way of dealing with this situation, and so they then turned to Jesus. And so they run to Jesus and wake him up, and they're obviously in a panic, and Jesus just gets up. Bible doesn't say he got up fast or he like ran to the front of the boat and he was all panicked or whatever. No, it just says that Jesus got up and was like, why y'all so afraid? Like, where's your faith at, man? And he just gets up and he looks at the raging storm around him, and he didn't shout and he didn't yell. The Bible says that he just spoke. He rebukes the storm, which is interesting because if you know your Bible and you know your theology, you know that that when God created everything at the beginning of time, the book of John says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, meaning that Jesus was with God in those very moments when everything was created, meaning that they did that together. Jesus and God would never rebuke nature itself. They would never rebuke the very thing that they created. And so what that tells us is that this was actually no natural storm, that this was a storm that had a spiritual component to it. Because what you have to understand is you never see God or Jesus rebuking the very thing, the very creation that they've made, because they marvel and revel in those things. What they do is they rebuke the one who twists and distorts that creation into something terrible. And since sin came into the world, Satan had authority over the earth. So Satan had the authority to cause this to happen. Yes, he used God's creation to do it, but he's the real thing that Jesus is rebuking. And so Jesus rebukes the storm that was placed there by Satan. And that storm was placed there because he knew that Jesus was about to do something really incredible on the other side of that storm. And so when Jesus got into that boat, he knew that that storm was coming. He knew that that was going to be an obstacle in his life and the life of the disciples. He knew that was going to be there, and yet he still chose to sleep. Why? Because Jesus was not afraid of that storm. He wasn't afraid of the wind and the waves. He wasn't afraid of the rain. He wasn't afraid that the boat might sink. He just wasn't afraid because he knew that his life and the life of his friends, in the end, all those things, he knew that all of that were in the mighty hands of his Father. And that no matter how bad that storm became and no matter how awful it was, that everything was still in the hands of God because Jesus had made sure that they had been placed there. So when he was woken up and he saw how scared his disciples were, he was really deeply disappointed with them. That's where the whole, line of, where is your faith or how little faith do you have, depending on the translation, that's where that line comes from. He was disappointed with them not because they had failed, but because they had not realized who they had been walking and working and talking and eating with all this time. So he got up and he showed them who he was and to whom he belonged. And they were so stunned by this power and his authority that they could only respond by saying, "Who is this man?" If it wasn't the storm, you have to understand in this whole situation, it wasn't the physical storm itself that was sinking this boat. It was the waves that this storm was creating. And every single one of us in this world right now, we are all facing the same storm. The same storm of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and a lot of us being quarantined or being locked down. And while that storm in and of itself is causing problems with the people who are getting sick, we are all dealing with waves that this pandemic is creating in our life. And that's causing the life, our boat, which is our life, to sink. And for a lot of you, some of those waves are with your parents. For a lot of you, some of those waves are with your siblings. Or those waves are dealing with your schoolwork and having to do it at home. Maybe some of you love that. Maybe some of you are really struggling with that. Or waves because there's a lot of stress on your mom or your dad or whoever your guardian is, and whatever situation you have, it's making everything really tumultuous and scary. But for all of you, a lot of the waves that we're dealing with because of this storm that we're all riding through right now are coming from our own soul, you know. And I want to explain that by asking you this question: like, are you scared? Are you worried, uncertain, confused, angry, bitter right now because of everything that's happening? Are those waves crashing over the sides and making you stumble and fall all over the place, all over the boat of your life? What waves are sinking your boat right now? But more importantly, why are you so afraid of them? Because if Jesus is sleeping through the storm, then that means Jesus is not afraid. And if Jesus is not afraid, then why are you? When you face the storms of your life and whether or not you'll survive them or not, it's that whole thing. It's not about who you are. It's about whose you are. Because if you belong to Jesus, then it's who he is all that matters. So who are you? But more importantly, who do you belong to today? Some of you really need to ask yourself that question. You need to ask yourself, to whom do I belong? And if it's not Jesus, because you're going to belong to something or you're going to belong to someone, like you don't really have a choice. We all belong to someone. We really, really do. In a worldly sense, we belong to our parents, we belong to our families, we belong to a lot of different things, but in the grand spiritual sense of everything, you belong to someone. And if you don't belong to Jesus, then you belong to someone who is far more nefarious and someone who just really does not care about how your life turns out. And as a matter of fact, he wants your life to be ruined. And so we need to understand that when it comes to this world and this life and the choices that we make every single day, you're going to decide who you belong to. And would you rather belong to the one who makes you tremble in fear and in desperation and in confusion, or would you rather belong to the one who makes the darkness and fear itself tremble? You guys, I want to implore you, during this time period in our life when we're all riding through a storm together and we all have waves crashing over the sides of our boat, I want to implore you and encourage you, belong to Jesus. Belong to him every single day, because when you do, there is no storm that will come against you in this life that you'll ever have to be afraid of. Remember, it's not who you are, it's whose you are. So choose to be Jesus. Choose to be Jesus's. Belong to Him. I love you guys. I miss you. Don't forget about our Zoom call tomorrow night. I'll see you soon.